They ask me sometimes, the younger ones, whether I believed in it before the war, whether I thought love was real, the way the old songs described it, something that arrives without warning, strikes like a sickness, rewrites the architecture of a man from the inside out. I tell them I was a scientist. I tell them I believed in measurable things. Then they ask what changed. I don't always answer. Some things I still keep close. But I'm getting older and there are fewer of us left who were there at the beginning, who saw the coral in their first full bloom, who watched what happened to the ones they took, who understand why we did what we did in the valley at the end. So I'll tell it now, the whole of it, the way it actually happened. Not the version in the debriefs. Not the version they published in the Reconstruction journals. The version I lived. My name is Marcus Reeve, Staff Sergeant, 3rd Xenobiology Detachment, attached to the Frontier Stabilization Corps when the Choral came. I was 34 years old. I had not spoken to my ex-wife in 2 years. I kept a photograph of her in my breast pocket out of habit, or stubbornness, or some failure of will I'd never diagnosed properly. I mention this because it matters. You'll see why. The coral arrived the way a lot of things arrive that will eventually kill you, quietly, without announcement, in a form you don't immediately recognize as dangerous. The first reports called them acoustic anomalies, regions of altered electromagnetic signature in the upper atmosphere, initially attributed to solar activity, to debris, to the kind of institutional mistake that happens when 3 different agencies are each certain the other one is monitoring a situation. By the time the 3rd colony node established itself over the Canadian interior, someone in a government building with good windows figured out that no known physics explained what was sitting in the sky above Saskatoon. They didn't look like what you'd call invaders. That was the first problem. I've read every description in the literature and none of them quite land it. The closest I can manage. Imagine a structure the size of a city block but translucent, not glass translucent, more the way deep ocean water is translucent, where you know something is there but the light bends around it and your eye keeps losing focus. Irregular geometry, no hard edges, no obvious propulsion, no exhaust, no visible mechanical components. They drifted, they settled. And then, within 48 hours of settlement, the people who lived nearest to them started behaving strangely. Not violently, that was the second problem. The affected individuals didn't attack anyone. They didn't flee. They became, by every observable measure, profoundly, radiantly happy. They smiled at strangers. They hugged neighbors they hadn't spoken to in years. They called estranged family members. They quit jobs they'd hated. They stood in fields and city parks with their faces tilted upward and their eyes half closed, and witnesses described them as looking at peace, and like they'd finally remembered something they'd forgotten. It took the military 2 full weeks to classify this as a threat. I understand the hesitation. I've read the early internal cables. Several senior officials argued, genuinely and at length, that whatever the coral were doing might constitute a net humanitarian improvement over baseline human misery. There was a memo, I've seen it, I'm not inventing this, from a deputy undersecretary suggesting that the affected population's elevated serotonin and oxytocin readings might warrant further study before any intervention was authorized. The memo did not survive contact with what happened to the affected population in week 3. What happened in week 3 was that they stopped being people. I need to say that plainly because the academic literature tends toward euphemism. The phrase the journals prefer is behavioral reorganization consistent with primary host integration. What that means, stripped of the language that makes it easier to write, is that the people near the nodes stopped having individual desires. They stopped having preferences. They moved when the coral moved, stopped when it stopped, gathered in formations that corresponded to the node's internal geometry, and when they spoke, which was infrequently, and in a flat, unhurried tone, they spoke in first-person plural. We are here, we are listening. There is no need for the noise you are making. We lost an estimated 40,000 people in the initial nodes before the quarantine lines went up. Most of them never showed fear. Most of them, by every observable biometric, were experiencing something that looked from the outside like deep contentment. I have never stopped finding that the most disturbing part. I was not in the field for those first weeks. I was at the Lakewood Research Annex in Colorado, which had been repurposed into an emergency xenobiology staging facility. My job, initially, was to analyze the bioelectric signature data coming in from the quarantine perimeters and try to determine the mechanism. How were the coral doing what they were doing? What frequency? What range? Was there a threshold of exposure? Was there a treatment? I had a team of 7. We worked in 16-hour rotations. We ate bad food and slept in cots and talked in the shorthand of people who are frightened but professionally obligated not to show it. The woman who changed everything was not on my team. Her name was Dr. Adrienne Choral. She was a cognitive neurologist attached to a different division. She was working the behavioral modeling side, trying to construct a predictive map of how the integration progressed through a population. She arrived at Lakewood on a Tuesday in October, 3 months into the crisis, with 2 duffel bags and a portable hard drive full of data that her superiors had told her was not actionable and that she decided to bring anyway. I met her in the cafeteria at 200. She was the only other person in the room. She had the look I recognized from the mirror, the particular controlled tension of someone who has been awake for too long working on a problem that scares them, and who has not yet decided how scared to be. She was looking at a printed graph spread across the table, and she had a red pen in her hand, and she was making small notations in the margin with the careful focus of someone who had found something and wasn't yet sure it was what she thought. I refilled my coffee and asked what she was looking at. She looked up. She had brown eyes and short hair gone prematurely gray at the temples, and she had the voice of someone who had spent years in front of students, unhurried, precise, with the habit of making sure you'd understood before she moved on. Resonance data, she said. From the integrated subjects, I've been mapping the dominant frequency of the bioelectric state they shift into after integration and comparing it to pre-integration baselines. I sat down across from her, uninvited. She didn't object. What do you find? She turned the graph around so I could see it. The dominant frequency of the integrated state is not new. It's not something the coral is generating and imposing from scratch. She tapped the paper. It's an amplified, stabilized, artificially sustained version of a frequency the human brain produces naturally. I looked at the graph, then I looked at her. When? During states of deep affiliative bonding, she said, parental attachment, long-term pair bonding, what people colloquially call being in love. The cafeteria was very quiet. Outside somewhere, a perimeter alarm cycled through its nightly test. They're not installing a new signal, I said slowly. No, they're hijacking one we already have. The coral emits a carrier frequency that entrains the human limbic system to a specific resonant state, then sustains that state artificially and amplifies it until it overrides every other signal in the brain. The individual doesn't lose consciousness. They lose priority. She picked up the red pen and set it down again. The experience is, neurologically, indistinguishable from profound love. The subject feels genuine connection, genuine belonging, genuine peace. They are not suffering. They are simply no longer steering. I sat with that for a moment. Can it be reversed? I don't know yet. Can it be blocked? Also don't know. That's your side of the problem. She looked at me steadily. But I think blocking is the wrong frame. If you try to jam the frequency, you're trying to jam a signal the brain generates on its own. You can't selectively silence it without causing damage. What you need is to find a way to make the brain's own version of the signal loud enough that the coral's version can't achieve dominance. I stared at her. She stared back. You want to use love as a countermeasure, I said. I want to use the neurological substrate of affiliative bonding as a countermeasure, she said, which is the same thing. Yes. That was October. What followed was 4 months of work I will not describe in full because it would require a separate document, and most of it was failure. Controlled, documented, occasionally productive failure, but failure. We knew the concept. We had no mechanism. You cannot tell people to feel something on command, and even if you could, the coral's carrier signal was strong enough to swamp any naturalistic response within range of a node. What we needed was a way to induce the genuine article, reliably, rapidly, at scale, and sustain it against the coral's interference. We did not know how to do that. What we had by the end of February was a partial map of the relevant neurological pathways, a prototype of a device Adrian called the resonator, a wearable emitter that could stimulate the pathway artificially, and approximately 300 pages of research that amounted to a very thorough description of everything that wouldn't work. We also had, by that point, something I hadn't planned for and had no professional framework to address. I am not going to describe it the way the debrief made it sound, clinical, incidental, a footnote to the operational context. I'm going to describe it the way it was. Adrian Choral was the most rigorous mind I had worked alongside in 20 years of scientific practice. She was also funny, in the dry, sideways manner of someone who has learned to use humor as structural support. She had opinions about things that had nothing to do with the crisis, about bad architecture, about the precise temperature at which coffee becomes undrinkable, about the particular arrogance of researchers who mistake complexity for intelligence. She had a daughter she called every Sunday without fail, even after the communications infrastructure degraded and the calls took 3 relay station bounces and arrived with a 4-second lag. She kept a small potted succulent on her desk that she had carried in her luggage from her previous posting, and she talked to it, very briefly, when she thought no one was watching. I was watching most of the time. I want to be honest about that. I was also honest with myself about what was happening, which was more than I deserved, given my track record. I knew what I felt. I knew when it started, which was approximately the 3rd week, when I had said something dismissive about a piece of data, and she had looked at me for 2 seconds with an expression of patient, total disagreement, and then calmly dismantled my argument with 4 observations I had no counter to. And I had sat there in the wreckage of my position and thought, for no reason I can explain, she is exactly right, and I have not been this happy in years. I didn't say anything about it. We were in the middle of a planetary crisis. There was no appropriate context. I was her operational superior in the chain of command, which made the situation additionally complicated, and I was also, as I have noted, in possession of a photograph of my ex-wife that I hadn't managed to take out of my breast pocket in 2 years, which said something unflattering about my emotional processing. So I said nothing. I worked. I was professional. I looked at her data and contributed to hers, and we had long conversations about mechanism and approach that were, I told myself, entirely scientific in character. She found out, of course. She was a cognitive neurologist. She noticed things. She said on a Thursday evening in January, very quietly, while we were both looking at a display screen and not at each other, "I want to be clear about something." I said, "All right." "I'm not going to pretend I haven't noticed," she said. "And I'm not going to pretend I don't." She stopped, started again. "But I think we need to let this be what it is right now, which is something that makes the work better and doesn't make it worse, and not try to define it beyond that, because I don't know what the world looks like on the other side of this, and I find I'm not willing to make promises I can't assess the probability of keeping." I looked at her then. She was looking at the screen. "That's the most scientifically framed personal statement I've ever heard," I said. The corner of her mouth moved, very slightly. "I'm a scientist." "So am I said, "and I find I don't have an argument with any of it." We went back to work. But something had shifted. I think we both knew it. There is a particular quality to the silence between two people who have acknowledged something without nomming it, a weight, a warmth, an awareness. It changed the character of the long hours. It changed the way the work felt, which I had not expected and which I could not entirely account for, and which was, I recognized even then, relevant data. March came, the coral spread. 3 new nodes established over the Pacific coast. The quarantine zones, already stretched, buckled in 2 sectors. We lost contact with a relay station in Idaho that had been running clean for 4 months. Sporadic integration events began occurring outside the official perimeter, suggesting that the carrier frequency was increasing in range. The military response had been, to this point, largely defensive. Everything offensive had failed. Conventional munitions did nothing visible to the nodes, no structural damage, no behavioral change, no apparent awareness that they'd been hit. Directed energy weapons briefly interrupted the carrier signal within a limited radius, but the coral compensated within minutes, strengthening the frequency rather than reducing it. We had tried disrupting the signal from the ground, from aircraft, from orbital platforms. The signal adapted, strengthened, spread. There was a meeting in the 3rd week of March, attended by people whose names I will not use, at which the serious option was discussed. The one that involved high-yield detonation over 3 of the primary nodes. The estimated casualty figures for the integrated population within the blast radii were presented. 42,000 in the most conservative estimate. 42,000 people who were, neurologically, experiencing something close to peace. The meeting did not reach consensus. It was tabled for 48 hours. Adrian and I worked through both nights. What she found, and I want to be precise about this, because the after-action reports attribute the breakthrough to the team rather than to her specifically. And that is a bureaucratic fiction I have personal objections to. What Adrian found was in the raw frequency data from the integrated subjects, specifically from a small cohort of subjects who had been integrated for 90 or more days. In the long integration subjects, the coral's carrier signal was dominant. That was expected, but underneath it, barely detectable like a heartbeat under machinery, was a second signal, faint, unsteady, persistent. The subject's own frequency, still there, still running. "They're not gone," she said. She said it very quietly, standing in front of the data display at 300, and I could hear in her voice the particular quality of someone who has just found a door they were not certain existed. The coral doesn't erase, it overwhelms. The subject's signal is still being generated. The underlying process is still running. It's just buried under 60 decibels of interference. So if you could reduce the interference, or increase the subject's own signal enough to achieve resonance with the coral frequency rather than being drowned by it. She turned around. Her eyes were bright. Not fighting the signal, matching it, and then shifting it. If we could tune the resonator to broadcast at a frequency that sits just adjacent to the coral's carrier, but draws from the subject's own baseline. I understood what she was saying. I understood it all at once, the whole shape of it. It would be pulling them back from the inside, I said. Yes. Using their own bonding signal as the anchor. Yes. And the resonator broadcasts the frequency. The subject's brain recognizes it as native. And it gives their signal something to lock onto, a handhold, a direction. She looked at me. It won't work for everyone. The long integration subject's 90 days longer, the signal is very faint. It may not be recoverable, but for the recent integrations, the ones we can reach within the first 60 days. How many? She had clearly already run the numbers. In the accessible quarantine zones, accounting for estimated integration timelines, somewhere between 12 and 18,000 individuals. 12 to 18,000 people, against 42,000 in the blast radius. Not a perfect equation, nothing in a war is. The resonator prototype, I said, range. Point source as built, approximately 8 meters, but the frequency propagates if I adjust the emission pattern and we deploy multiple units in a coordinated array. She moved to the workstation. Give me 6 hours. I gave her 6 hours. I sat at the adjacent bench and did the math on deployment geometry and tried not to watch her work, and mostly failed. At 900, we presented the revised protocol to the command group. At 1100, we received authorization for a limited field trial at the easternmost quarantine zone, the most recently established, with the highest proportion of early integration subjects. The field trial was my operation. I had asked to lead it. I want to be honest about why. I was afraid that if I sent someone else and something went wrong, there would be no one present who understood what Adrian's work actually meant. That was the professional reason. The personal reason was that I did not want to sit at the annex and wait for reports. Adrian was not permitted in the field. She was not combat qualified, and the quarantine zones were, by that point, not safe for unprotected personnel. I spent 20 minutes arguing for a dispensation. I didn't get it. We stood in the vehicle bay at 600 on the morning of deployment. My team was loading equipment into the transports. The light was gray, early spring, with that particular flat quality of morning in high altitude. She handed me a copy of the resonator calibration, parameters on a data chip. Back up, she said, in case the primary unit corrupts. I took it. Our fingers didn't quite touch. I had in my breast pocket the photograph I still hadn't removed. Reeve, she said. Yeah. Come back. She said it in the tone of someone making a scientific observation, flat, certain, non-negotiable. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about saying something. I decided against it because there was a transport waiting and a timeline and 42,000 people sitting in the balance, and because some things keep better when they aren't opened ahead of schedule. I always do, I said. I got in the transport. The quarantine zone was a rural district, 40 miles across, centered on a node that had been active for approximately 50 days. Farms, a small town, a river valley. In the spring light it looked ordinary fields beginning to green, trees in early bud, the node itself sitting 200 meters above the valley floor, translucent and huge and utterly still. The people moved beneath it in loose formations. From the transport at distance, they looked almost normal. It was only when you got closer that you saw the uniformity of expression, the unhurried way they moved in rhythm with each other, the way their faces, when they turned toward the sound of our engines, showed no alarm and no curiosity. Only that flat, suffused contentment. That expression was harder to look at than anything I have seen in a combat zone. I include that assessment as a clinical observation and as a personal one. We deployed in teams of 4, each team carrying 3 resonator units modified to Adrian's revised emission pattern. The protocol was to establish a field perimeter around a cluster of integrated subjects, activate all 3 units simultaneously, and hold position until behavioral response was observed or until the 8-minute exposure threshold elapsed, whichever came first. The first 2 deployments produced nothing. The subjects stood in the field within the resonator perimeter, their faces upturned, and did not change. I adjusted the calibration on Unit 3. A minor correction, a fraction of a hertz, based on a marginal note in Adrian's calibration data that I had memorized without intending to. The third deployment was different. The subject was a man of perhaps 60. He was standing at the edge of what had been a wheat field, now unharvested and going to seed, with his arms loose at his sides and his eyes open, looking at nothing. He had been in the zone for 41 days by our estimate. His name, we found out later, was Harold Engel. He had been a farmer. He had 3 children, 2 in other states, 1 locally who had been integrated alongside him. I stood 8 meters from him with the unit active and the frequency running, and I watched. The change was not dramatic. I want to be clear about that because dramatic is what gets written down. What actually happened was subtle and slow and looked, for the first 4 minutes like nothing at all. Then his eyes moved. Not the uniform, unhurried tracking of the integrated state. His eyes moved the way eyes move when a person is looking for something. A quick shift, a focus, a search. His breathing changed. His face did not change, not yet, but something under his face changed. Some structural quality, as if a muscle group that had been relaxed for 40 days was being asked, very tentatively, to work again. He said very quietly, "Helen." His daughter's name, it turned out, the one who'd been integrated locally. I didn't know that yet. What I knew was that he had said a name, and saying a name is a thing that requires a self. You cannot call for someone if you have no conception of yourself as separate from the collective. Calling for someone is an act of individuation. Calling for someone is grief made audible, and grief requires knowing what you've lost. The choral's carrier frequency fluctuated. I could see it on the handheld monitor. A brief disruption, 30 seconds, localized, as if the node overhead had noticed something and shifted its attention. Harold Engel stood in the field and called for his daughter, and the choral heard it, and it pushed back. What followed, I will describe with the precision it deserves. The resonator units held frequency. They were designed for exactly this, not to defeat the carrier signal in a direct contest, but to sustain a competing pattern long enough for the subject's own neural baseline to reestablish. It was Adrian's calculation, and it was correct, and it held by a margin that I have estimated in retrospect was probably 2 or 3 hertz. Close, very close. Harold Engel fell to his knees, not the choral bringing him down, the opposite. His legs giving out beneath the weight of a returning consciousness, the way sensation returns to a limb that's been compressed too long, painful, disorienting, arriving all at once. He was disoriented for approximately 3 minutes. Then he looked at me. Not through me, at me. "Where is she?" he said. His voice was rough, unused, sounding like a machine running for the first time in months. "Where is Helen?" "She's in the zone," I told him. "We're going to try to bring her back." Something moved across his face. Something I recognized. It was the expression of a man who loves someone and has understood, in one lucid moment, the full measure of what almost happened. "Tell me what to do," he said. We brought his daughter back 4 hours later, using a modified protocol that incorporated Harold himself as a secondary emitter, standing within range, talking to her, calling her name. The theory was Adrian's, transmitted via relay communication. The genuine bioelectric signal of a person actively loving someone provides a native resonance that a mechanical emitter cannot fully replicate. The real thing, not the choral's approximation. The actual frequency of a man who has known this person for 30 years and is terrified of losing her. It worked. It worked the way real things work, which is messily and slowly and without any guarantee until it was suddenly, undeniably done. Helen Engel came back. We retrieved 41 people from the valley that day. Of the 41, 37 showed complete behavioral restoration within 24 hours. 4 retained some residual integration symptoms that resolved over the following week. None experienced significant long-term cognitive impairment. We transmitted everything: data, recordings, calibration parameters, the revised protocol including the role of proximal bonded individuals as secondary emitters, to the annex that evening. Adrian called on the relay comm at 2300. "The protocol works," she said. "The protocol works," I said. There was a pause. "Harold Engel brought his daughter back," I said. Another pause. I could hear through the relay static the quality of her silence. "I know," she said. "I watched the recording. You were right about the secondary emitter." "Yes," she paused again. "How are you?" It was the first time she had asked that in 4 months of working together. Not the efficient version, "Are you functional? Are you operational? Are you rested enough to continue?" The actual question, "How are you?" I was sitting on the ground outside the mobile unit with my back against the transport wheel, looking up at the sky, in which the node still hung. Quiet and enormous, beginning, for the first time, to pulse in a way I had not seen before. The data teams later described this as a stress response, the coral adapting to a new threat. "I think I'm all right," I said. "I'll tell you more accurately when I'm back." "All right," she said, "I'll be here. The next 6 weeks I will compress, because the specific operations are recorded elsewhere, and because this is not a history of the campaign. This is a personal account, and the personal account is this." The protocol scaled. It was not fast. It was not clean. Scaling, a method that depends on genuine human bonding across a planetary crisis zone, is by definition a logistical problem without elegant solutions. We could not manufacture love. We could not manufacture the secondary emitter effect. What we could do was identify individuals with established close relationships to integrated subjects and train them in the proximity protocol. Parents, children, spouses, friends of 30 years. People who had something to lose that was specifically, irreplaceably personal. The coral adapted as it always did. It increased carrier power over the active recovery zones. It shifted the dominant frequency slightly, trying to create a mismatch. It began to target the unintegrated individuals near recovery operations. Specifically, in a pattern our analysts identified in week 4, it began preferentially targeting the secondary emitters, the people doing the calling. It understood, in whatever way a colonial organism understands things, that they were the threat. This told us something important. The coral had a weakness, and the weakness was that it could not replicate its own countermeasure. It could broadcast the frequency of love, an artificial, sustained, manufactured version. It could use that frequency as a weapon. What it could not do, apparently, was generate the genuine article, because the genuine article requires something the coral did not have. Loss, memory, accumulated specific attachment to an irreplaceable individual, the particular weight of a life spent alongside someone, which cannot be reproduced from observation or algorithm, the ability to grieve. The coral could weaponize love. It could not love. This distinction, once articulated, became the central premise of the final operation. I was back at the annex by the 3rd week of April. The command group was planning the push, a coordinated simultaneous deployment across all 7 active node sites, using the full resonance array in combination with the secondary emitter network. The logistics were enormous. The timeline was compressed. The margin for error was approximately 0. I went to Adrian's office the night before the briefing. I knocked on the open door. She was at her workstation, as I'd expected, reviewing frequency models. The succulent on her desk was, improbably, thriving. She had, apparently, a talent for keeping things alive under adverse conditions. She looked up. "I need to show you something," I said. I took the photograph out of my breast pocket. It was worn at the edges. The image faded in the way photographs fade when they've been carried close to a body for a long time. My ex-wife at 30, in a garden, looking sideways at the camera, half smiling. Adrian looked at the photograph, then at me. She said nothing. "I've been carrying this for 2 years," I said. "I'm not certain I know why. I think I was using it the way people use evidence of old wounds to remind themselves to be careful, to not try again." I looked at the photograph. "It doesn't do what I thought it did. I think it actually did the opposite." I set it on her desk. "I'm done carrying it." She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up and looked at it carefully, the way she looked at data. "She looks like someone who knows what she wants," she said. "She does. We wanted different things. That's the end of the story." "Is it?" "Yes." I met her eyes. "I want to tell you something before tomorrow, in case tomorrow goes badly, which it may. I've been trying to find the correct professional context for it for 4 months, and I've accepted that there isn't one, and I'm going to say it anyway." She set the photograph down. She turned her chair to face me fully. Her expression was the one she used for data she found credible and significant. I told her what I'd thought on that third week, about being exactly right and not being that happy in years. I told her that what followed hadn't changed the assessment, that I found her not beautiful, not in the language of the old songs, but something more specific and harder to name. Irreplaceable, the right frequency. She listened to all of it. She was quiet for a moment after. I told you in January that I wasn't willing to make promises I couldn't assess the probability of keeping, she said. I remember. I've been collecting more data since then. I looked at her. The probability, she said carefully, has improved. I nodded. All right, I said. We sat together for a while, not saying much. Outside, the facility was in full operational surge, lights and vehicles and voices and the weight of what tomorrow would require. Inside the office, it was quiet. The succulent sat on the desk in the lamplight. The photograph sat next to it. Eventually, I went back to my quarters and slept, which I had not been doing reliably, and slept better than I had in months. The next morning was the final push. I will not detail every deployment. 7 sites, simultaneous. 312 recovery teams in the field. 11,400 secondary emitters, fathers and daughters, mothers and sons, old friends, estranged siblings who'd come back across 10 states or 20 years because someone had called them and said, "We have a way, but we need you specifically. We need you and nobody else will do." The Choral responded as expected. It pushed back hard, harder than it had at the Valley. The carrier signal increased across all 7 nodes simultaneously. A coordinated response that told us, definitively, that the nodes were in communication with each other, that what we faced was a single distributed organism with a single strategic awareness. It knew what we were doing. It understood that the thing trying to pull its hosts back was the same signal it had been weaponizing for 8 months. It understood the irony, or whatever the Choral had instead of irony. It tried to overwhelm. What it could not account for was scale. 11,000 people, standing at the edges of quarantine zones, calling the names of the people they'd come to find. The resonator arrays running Adrian's calibrated frequency. And underneath it all, the signal itself, not artificial, not manufactured, not sustainably suppressible, just the actual frequency of actual human beings who actually had something to lose and who were refusing, in that specific human way, to accept the accounting as final. The Choral's carrier signal peaked at 9:47 and began to degrade at 9:53. 6 minutes. That is how long it took, once the full network was active, for the genuine signal to overwhelm the manufactured one. 6 minutes, 11,000 people, and the weight of everything they'd accumulated over lifetimes of specific, irreplaceable attachment. I was in the field for it. I was at the site near the Valley, Harold Engel's site, because we'd identified it as the highest probability location for demonstrating the secondary emitter effect, and because I had, I'll admit, a personal feeling about the place. I watched the nodes go dark. Not violently, not with a sound or a detonation or any of the dramatic conclusions you might construct for it. They simply stopped. The translucent geometry lost its coherence. The drifting, uncertain mass began to disperse slowly, without any visible distress, into the upper atmosphere, where it dissipated over the following 96 hours into nothing that any instrument could detect. The people in the field stopped moving in formation. They stood still for a moment, then they began to look around. I saw a woman in her 40s turn slowly, scanning the field, with an expression I recognized, that particular quality of a returned consciousness, disoriented and searching. She said something. A name. Her husband was running toward her from the perimeter line. He was 60 years old and not in good physical condition, and he ran like a man who has not permitted himself to consider that this might not work and is only now, in real time, understanding that it has. He reached her. She said his name again, uncertain, still finding herself, still sorting through what was real. He said her name back, twice, certain. She started to cry. I have had a lot of classified briefings tell me that the emotional responses of the recovered population are outside the scope of the operational summary. They are correct. They are also wrong about what matters. What matters is that 12,714 people came back. What matters is that the frequency the Choral chose as its weapon, the one it calculated would be easiest to manufacture and most effective to deploy, turned out to be the frequency we couldn't generate artificially, not reliably, not at the scale that mattered. The Choral built its entire strategy around the human signal it thought it understood. It didn't understand it. It never did. You can map a frequency. You can replicate its parameters. You can sustain it artificially at amplitudes no human nervous system could achieve alone. What you cannot replicate is what generates it. You cannot replicate the accumulated weight of specific years, specific choices, the scar tissue, and the patience, and the stubborn refusal to let the thing you love go without a fight. You cannot manufacture the willingness to stand in a field and call a name into silence and mean it completely, with no certainty you'll get an answer. The Choral built a perfect copy of the frequency. It forgot to ask what the frequency was for. I called Adrienne at 10:13. I said, "It's done." She said, "I know, I'm watching the data." Then she said, "Come back." Same words as before. Same tone, flat, certain, non-negotiable. This time I said what I hadn't said the first time. I said, "I'm already on my way." It has been 11 years. The Choral has not returned. The monitoring networks would tell us within hours if anything like them appeared again, and so far nothing. The integrated individuals recovered, most of them fully, a handful with lingering effects that the medical literature is still characterizing. Harold Engel is still farming the valley. His daughter teaches at the school in the nearest town. We exchanged letters a few years back. He wrote that he thinks about the frequency sometimes, about what it felt like to be inside it, before the call pulled him out. He said it felt like being held, and that the difference between that and actually being held by a person who loves you is the difference between being warm and being home. He is, by his own account, a man with a limited interest in abstractions. He arrived at that distinction himself. Adrienne and I were married in the fall of the same year the nodes went dark, in a small ceremony in a garden not unlike the one in the photograph I left on her desk. The photograph I no longer carry, because I no longer need it. The function it served, that particular scarred caution, that proof of prior damage, I found could be retired when I stopped treating love as a wound and started treating it as what it actually is, which is the most useful frequency we have. We have 2 children, a girl and a boy. The girl is named Helen, which was not my idea and which I find, every time I think about it, exactly right. The boy is 8 years old and has his mother's eyes and her particular way of listening, that quiet, complete attention that makes you feel like whatever you're saying matters. He does not know yet what his parents did in the crisis years. He will, eventually. I am not in a hurry, he has time. What I know is this. The Choral came with a weapon that looked like a gift and felt like peace, and they calculated that we would either surrender to it or shatter against it. They made a reasonable calculation, based on every metric they'd collected. They had studied us for a long time before they came. They had mapped our frequencies. They believed they knew the shape of what we were. They knew we could love. They didn't know we could grieve and choose and remember and come back. They didn't know that the signal, once generated, doesn't stop. Not with distance, not with interference, not with 8 months of suppression by an organism that had crossed the dark between stars to stand in our fields and tell us there was no need for the noise we were making. There is a need. There has always been a need. The noise is how we find each other. I think about the early days sometimes, the cafeteria at 200, the graph spread across the table, the red pen in her hand. I think about the particular quality of that first conversation, the way her mind worked, the way she turned the graph around so I could see it. I think about standing in the vehicle bay in the gray morning light, the transport waiting, the chip with the calibration data warm in my palm. I think about Harold Engel falling to his knees in a field he had farmed for 30 years, calling his daughter's name in a voice rough from weeks of silence. And the choral overhead, this ancient and vast and impossibly alien intelligence, feeling something it had not calculated, feeling the frequency shift, feeling the thing it had weaponized turned against it, and not being able to stop it. Because it didn't understand what it had taken. It took something from Harold Engel that it thought it could hold. It didn't understand that the thing it took had his name on it and only his name, that it had been accumulating for 30 years, that it had weight and history, and the particular shape of a life, spent in proximity to another person who matters to you in a way that no other person can substitute for. And that this specific, personal, irreplaceable weight, is the one thing that cannot be manufactured. The choral was old, older than us by all measurement. They had been to other worlds. We found evidence of this in the aftermath. In the dispersed material, the nodes left behind traces of other chemical signatures, other atmospheres, other biologies that did not survive their encounter. Species that lay down in the frequency and did not come back. Species that either lacked the signal entirely, or lacked what generates it, or lacked the ability to call it up when it was being suppressed. We were the first ones to fight back with the weapon it brought. I have considered this a long time, and I think what it means is not that we are the most intelligent or the most biologically sophisticated or the most operationally capable species the choral encountered. I think it means we are the most specifically, stubbornly attached to each other, not to our species in the abstract, to specific people, to individuals, to the particular way a specific person's mind works, the sound of a specific voice, the way a specific someone makes the work feel worth doing. The choral built its strategy on a signal that looked to them like an exploitable weakness, a vulnerability in the limbic system, a resonance that could be hijacked, stabilized, used to achieve integration without the violence that, presumably, had been necessary with less cooperative species. The vulnerability was real. The signal could be hijacked. Everything they calculated was accurate. What they missed is that the signal exists for a reason. It exists because we are the kind of creature that forms permanent, specific, asymmetrical, non-transferable attachments, and those attachments constitute the deepest operational layer of who we are, and the deepest operational layer of who we are is not a vulnerability. It is the fortress. You do not take a fortress by flooding it with a copy of what it protects. I have tried to explain this to various official bodies over the years, in various after-action reviews and scientific publications and occasional public addresses. I'm never certain I've said it right. The language of military analysis makes it sound strategic. The language of neuroscience makes it sound mechanistic. What it actually was is something closer to what Harold Engel said in his letter, the difference between being warm and being home. The choral gave us warmth. We already had homes. That is a distinction worth dying for, and some of us did in those months, not in the final push, where we held, but in the operations before it, in the quarantine zones, in the sectors where the carrier signal was too strong for the resonator arrays to hold, and the teams who went in didn't come back. I know their names. I won't list them here because a list is the wrong form for names. Names belong in sentences, in stories, in the mouths of people who loved them and are still calling. The ones we lost. I call their names sometimes quietly in the way Harold Engel called his daughters. Not because I expect an answer. Because calling is what we do. Because the noise is how we hold on. Because the frequency, once started, does not stop, and I would rather be the kind of creature that cannot stop generating it than the kind that never had it to begin with. That is the whole of what I know. That is the story as it happened. The choral came, and they had studied us. And they had a weapon made from the best thing in us, and we took it back, and we brought our people home. I am Marcus Reeve. I am 61 years old. My wife is asleep down the hall, and my children are in their rooms, and outside the night is quiet, and in the morning I will wake up and the work will continue. The long, ordinary work of being alive and specific and here, in this particular life, with these particular people, at this particular frequency. That is enough. That has always been enough. That is what we were fighting for. I did not plan to write any of this down. It was Adrienne who suggested it. She argued, with characteristic precision, that I am one of fewer than 40 people still living who were operational at the senior level for the full duration of the crisis, and that the actuarial tables suggest this number will be substantially smaller in another decade, and that there is accordingly a diminishing window in which first-hand account can be distinguished from institutional reconstruction. She is correct. She is almost always correct, and I have learned to work with this rather than against it. What she did not say, but what I understood from the way she looked at me when she said it, is that she wants the story told in a way that gets it right. Not the operational account, not the scientific history, but the human account, the one that explains why it worked the way it worked, which requires explaining what the work actually was and what it cost, and what we found in it that we had not been looking for. So I have tried. I have tried to tell it plainly, without the language that makes it easier to write and harder to feel. I have tried to say what actually happened in the cafeteria at 200, and in the vehicle bay, and in Harold Engel's field, and in Adrienne's office the night before the push. I have tried not to make it larger than it was, because what it was is already large enough. 12,714 people came home. A colonial organism that had crossed interstellar distance, that had survived encounters with species we will never know the names of, that had built its entire strategic model on a precise and sophisticated understanding of the human nervous system. That organism encountered the one thing it could not account for, which was the specific gravity of specific human love, and it lost. Not because we were smarter, not because we had better technology, because we were the kind of creature that generates a signal the universe apparently has no efficient means of stopping once it has achieved sufficient amplitude in a sufficient number of sources simultaneously. I call this the threshold effect in the papers. Adrienne calls it something shorter. She calls it critical mass. I have thought about that phrase a long time. It comes from the vocabulary of chain reactions, the point at which a reaction becomes self-sustaining, no longer requiring external input to continue. Below the threshold, the reaction fades. Above it, it cannot be stopped. 11,000 people calling, 11,000 signals, and underneath each one, years of accumulated weight, the specific, irreplaceable, non-negotiable weight of a person who matters to you in a way that no argument, no suppression, no carrier frequency can fully displace, because it is not located in a frequency. The frequency is the symptom. The thing itself is located in the history, in the time, in the 100,000 specific moments of a shared life that cannot be replicated or replaced. The choral gave its integrated subjects warmth and peace and belonging. These are not nothing. In the long-term retrospective studies of recovered individuals, nearly all of them reported that the integrated state was not unpleasant, and several described a genuine grief at its loss. This I find neither surprising nor contradictory. What the integrated state could not give them was what warmth and peace and belonging are actually for. The state without the person is the frequency without the source. It is a recording of a voice rather than the voice. It sounds the same, nearly. It lacks the one thing that matters, which is the response, the specific, contingent, unpredictable, irreplaceable fact of another consciousness actually present, actually attending to you, actually affected by what you do and say and choose. The choral could manufacture the feeling of being loved. It could not actually love them. And this, I believe, I have believed for 11 years, I will die believing, is the only thing that ultimately matters. The genuine article, the actual presence of an actual other who has actual stakes in your continued existence and who is, right now, listening. That is what Harold Angel felt when his daughter came back and said his name. That is what my wife felt years later, safe and far from any quarantine zone, when she woke in the night and I was there. That is what the choral could not produce, and could not suppress, and could not outlast. I want to be careful not to romanticize this. The crisis was not a love story. People died. Good people, careful people, people who had done nothing to invite what came except exist in the signal range of something that had decided they were available for integration. The weight of those losses is real, and I carry it, and I do not pretend it is balanced by what we found in the work. But I also believe in precision, and the precise account of what happened is this. We won because we were specifically human in a way the choral had not fully modeled. We generated a signal they tried to use as a weapon, and the signal knew its own source, and the source could not be counterfeited. They came across the dark with a tool that was, essentially, a copy of us at our best, and we sent the original back at them. The original was louder. The original was always going to be louder. I have gone over this more times than I can count in the years since looking for the lesson. I think the lesson is not that love conquers all things. That is a sentiment, not a conclusion, and I am a scientist. The lesson is more specific, more operational, and more honest. The lesson is that what we actually are, not the imitation, not the manufactured version, not the optimized signal stripped of its inefficiencies, and sustained at controlled amplitude. What we actually are, with all its cost and all its weight and all the years of accumulated specific irreplaceable history, is harder to beat than anything that tried to replace it. The choral built a better love. We had the real one. I'll take that trade every time. There are things I still don't talk about easily. I mentioned the photograph earlier, the one I left on Adrian's desk, the one I'd carried for 2 years without fully understanding what I was carrying it for. I've thought about what it represented in the specific context of what we now know about the frequency and how it works. The choral strategy depended on subjects who were accessible, not physically accessible, accessible in the sense of having a gap. The integration moved fastest through populations with elevated rates of social isolation, attenuated attachment networks, compromised bonding histories. The quarantine zone data, cross-referenced with pre-integration census records, shows this clearly. The choral was better at taking people who were already partly outside the signal. I was partly outside the signal, had been for 2 years. I knew this at the time, in the way you know things about yourself that you're not prepared to act on yet. The photograph was evidence of that, not of the marriage, which was over and had been right to end, but of the gap it left. The frequency running without an adequate source. I think about what would have happened if the first node had established near Lakewood a year earlier, before Adrian. I think about whether the particular frequency I was generating in that period, diminished, without direction, running on memory rather than presence, would have been sufficient to resist the choral's carrier. I am not confident it would have been. This is not a romantic sentiment. It is a data point. Isolation is a vulnerability, not because it makes you weak in the ordinary sense, but because it diminishes the signal at precisely the threshold where signal strength is the only variable that matters. The choral knew this. They targeted for it. They identified the gaps in human attachment networks and entered there, and they were right that the signal would be more easily overwritten in those gaps. What they hadn't encountered, what I don't think they had ever encountered, was a species that actively works to close its own gaps. That turns toward each other rather than away. That identifies a vulnerability and treats it not as a given but as a problem to be solved. That has a Harold Angel who, the moment his own signal came back, immediately said, "Tell me what to do, not what do I do for myself, what do I do for Helen?" That is the part that I think the choral never modeled correctly. They modeled us as individuals with attachment responses. They did not fully account for the way attachment responses cause us to function as networks, as something that is, at the moment of actual crisis, larger than the sum of its individual signals. 11,000 people, each one attached to someone in the zone, each attachment its own history, its own weight, its own specific and irreplaceable frequency. And all of it in that morning in the final push, running simultaneously, pulling in the same direction, toward the people they had come to find. That is not a signal, that is an ocean. The Choral had measured the tide. They had not anticipated the storm. I was in the field for the full duration of the push, 6 hours, from first deployment to node dispersal. 6 hours of standing in the spring morning and watching the arrays hold and the secondary emitters call and the people in the fields begin to turn, begin to search, begin to say names. 6 hours of data that I had been trained to read clinically, and that I found I could not read clinically anymore. Not after Harold Engel's field, not after 4 months of building this with Adrian, not after the specific character of what it felt like to actually understand, in the marrow of it, what the frequency was for. A medic on my team, a young woman named Specialist Tran who had been pulling 18-hour shifts for 3 months and who I will remember until I die, started crying during the 4th hour and did not stop for the rest of the push. Not from distress. She said afterward when I asked, I just kept thinking they're coming back. They're actually coming back. And I couldn't hold it together and I didn't try. She received a commendation. The commendation does not mention the crying, which I consider a failure of documentation. What Specialist Tran understood in that moment was the same thing Harold Engel understood in the field, and the same thing Adrian understood when she identified the secondary emitter effect, and the same thing the Choral apparently understood when it began targeting the callers as the primary threat. The frequency, once you see what it does, once you understand what it actually is, and what it actually costs to generate and what it connects to, becomes impossible to treat as merely a mechanism. It is not merely a mechanism. It is the mechanism. It is the thing underneath everything else. It is what we are doing when we do what we do. All of it, the work and the grief and the long hours in the cafeteria at 200 and the calling into silence and the standing in the field, all of it is the frequency. All of it is the signal. All of it is us saying to each other, across whatever distance has opened up between us, I am here. I am still here. Come back. They came back. 12,714. And the Choral dispersed into the upper atmosphere, and the fields went quiet, and we went home.